My name is Susan Burkholder. I am a volunteer with this organization, Ransomed Life. We're a local organization here in the San Antonio area. We work with young ladies 12 to 17 who are survivors of local human trafficking or who are at risk of getting involved in the world of human trafficking. So that's the organization I'm a volunteer for. Just a little bit of my background. I was in the medical world for years and years. I served as in everything from sales to executive management, home health care, pharmaceutical industry, critical care. I've done research. I was a clinical research associate for a biotech company quite some time ago. I'm retired now, and so this is mainly what I do, is to speak to people about the issue of human trafficking. I will talk to anybody who will give me the time of day to talk about it, because it's something I'm passionate about informing people about. So we'll get started with our presentation. I would ask that as we go through this information, if you have questions, just jot them down. You've got most of the slides there with you. And we'll have plenty of time for questions at the very end. Chances are your question will get answered somewhere in the presentation. And if you ask a really good question and I go off on a tangent, we might be here for way too long. So we'll save all of that until the very end, if that's okay with all of you guys. All right, so what we're going to talk about today is human trafficking, which is the exact same thing as modern day slavery. Those two terms are completely interchangeable. Human trafficking and modern day slavery mean the exact same thing. According to the International Labor Organization, it is estimated that in the world today, there are 40 million people held as slaves. These are new numbers that just came out of the International Labor Organization back in October. People often say to me, they're like, hold up, Susan. I thought we abolished that here in the United States. I don't understand. And yes, slavery is illegal in every single country in the world, yet slavery happens today in every single country in the world. Murder is illegal in every single country in the world, yet murder happens in every country in the world. Just because something is illegal doesn't mean that criminals aren't going to do it. So there are more people held as slaves today in the world than there have ever been before in the history of humanity. Of those 40 million, it is estimated that 10 million of them are minors. 10 million of them are children. And we're going to sort of focus down a little bit into that as we go through this information today. But I want to just make this point for you guys. There is a difference legally from the crime of human trafficking and the crime of human smuggling. Kind of to give you guys a little bit of an analogy of that, if I am going to be smuggling or trafficking drugs, those are going to be two different crimes as well. If I put illegal drugs into my luggage and bring them across the border into the United States illegally, I am guilty of the crime of drug smuggling. I haven't done any drug trafficking. If I sell you drugs out of my kitchen, that's drug trafficking, whether I moved them across a border or not. See the difference there between drug trafficking and drug smuggling? The same is true of human beings. If I load a bunch of people into the back of an 18-wheeler and drive them across the border into San Antonio, Texas, and park that 18-wheeler, I am guilty of the crime of human smuggling. No one's been trafficked. Now, if I have some of those people go work somewhere and I don't pay them, or if I say, look, you owe me $5,000 because I smuggled you into the country, now you have to do what I tell you to do for free, then I'm also guilty of the crime of human trafficking. But do you guys see the two differences there? Sure, some of you recall that incident of an 18-wheeler here in San Antonio, Texas, back during the summer months. Chances are most of the people in that 18-wheeler were destined for human trafficking. That was probably going to happen to them, but bringing them across the border was the crime of human smuggling. So it makes sense to you guys? All right, so in 2009, human trafficking was estimated to be an $8 billion per year industry. It was listed as the #3 crime in the world of trafficking, behind drug trafficking, #1, and the illegal trafficking of guns. As of 2014, according to the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, human trafficking had escalated to a $32 billion per year industry and had surpassed drug trafficking as a criminal activity for money. As of 2016, according to the International Labor Organization, human trafficking is now a $150 billion per year industry. It is the #1 thing that criminals do in the world today to make money. It's the fastest growing crime in the world. And we'll talk more about why that is later, like why is that? That's a pretty dramatic increase from 2009 to 2016 of 8 billion to 150 billion. What's going on that's making that happen? So we'll talk some about that. There are different categories of human trafficking. We talk about international human trafficking. It happens in Indonesia, it happens in Bangladesh, it happens in other countries in the world. That's obviously international human trafficking. We call US human trafficking domestic human trafficking. So those are two different categories. We talk about those who are used in trafficking who are adults. So people traffic adults, both in the United States and internationally, and people traffic children, both in the United States and internationally. That picture right there is children who are harvesting cacao beans. That's where we get cocoa from, which is where we get chocolate from. Would highly recommend that you take a minute sometime in the next week and Google slave-free chocolate and learn more about the trafficking of children to create the chocolate that most of us buy. So adults can be trafficked and minors. We further categorize trafficking as labor trafficking or trafficking in the commercial sex industry. So you can have international trafficking of minors in the labor industry. You can have domestic trafficking of adults in the commercial sex industry. So any of those things, international or domestic, labor or sex trafficking adults and children. So we have categories, and we discuss that when we're talking about legislative issues and news reports. So the definition of human trafficking, according to the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, that was first enacted or made legislation in our country in 2000 and has been reenacted by our legislative process federally every single year and updated and made better. According to TVPA, a human trafficking victim is a person induced to perform labor or a commercial sex act through force, fraud, or coercion. So in a federal court, and actually even in a local court, it would have to be proven that someone used force, fraud, or coercion to get somebody to do something that they didn't want to do and somebody else benefited from that. However, when a minor is involved and it's in the commercial sex industry, that's all that needs to be proven. There's a minor, the commercial sex industry was involved, that's human trafficking. It doesn't matter whether that 14-year-old consented to be in the commercial sex industry. Well, she was willing to do that, or he was willing to do that. That's not a relevant defense in the United States of America. There is no need to prove force, fraud, or coercion when you have a minor involved in anything related to the commercial sex industry. So according to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, there has been an 846% increase in suspected child sex trafficking between 2010 and 2015. An 846% increase. Again, we're seeing those numbers escalating dramatically. I didn't even really understand what domestic minor sex trafficking was in 2010. And so since then, it's escalated greatly, and it continues to be very much on the rise. So sometimes people will say to me, Susan, you know, that trafficking is a big issue in San Antonio because we're so close to the border of Mexico. My brother said to me 4 years ago, he said, yeah, that thing you're involved in, like that human trafficking, that's a big deal in the United States in the sex industry because of all the Eastern European women that they bring in. The reality, according to the US Department of Justice, is that in the commercial sex industry in the United States, adults and children, the vast majority are United States citizens. It's a 10-to-1 ratio. The vast majority are US citizens. Yes, there are foreigners who are used in the commercial sex industry. That's a given, but that's not most of it. It's a business, it's simple math. It's much cheaper to acquire a product locally than it is to put one on an airplane or a ship or in a vehicle and bring them across the border into the United States. Plus, that's another crime, right? That's smuggling of humans. So let's talk about specific numbers right here in Texas. So 2 years ago, the governor commissioned the University of Texas School of Social Work to look at the numbers in Texas. So it took them 2 years. They used other departments within the University of Texas, not just the School of Social Work. They had a lot of other agencies helping them compile this data. It is very much an estimate, but it's a good estimate. It's based on good numbers. This was released in December of last year. I think it actually became publicized in January. And according to that study, the statewide Human Trafficking Mapping Project via the University of Texas, it is estimated that there are 313,000 people here in Texas who are being trafficked. That's adults, children, labor, and sex all combined, 313,000. Of those, it is estimated in that study that 79,000 of them are minors being used in the commercial sex industry. That means that there are 234,000 people, adults and children, in labor trafficking and adults in sex trafficking. So that's a pretty big number, 234,000 people in labor and adult sex trafficking. But that other bottom number is the one that makes me stand up here and do what I do because it breaks my heart. 79,000 minors in Texas are being used in the commercial sex industry. So the most prevalent form of sex trafficking in the United States is domestic minor sex trafficking. We call it DMST for short. It is also referred to as the commercial sexual exploitation of children, or CSEC. It's just easier for my mouth to move around DMST than it is for me to say CSEC. So all of my slides and for the rest of our day today, we're going to talk about DMST. But just know that when you read a news article or are looking into information about this, you'll see those two terms used interchangeably. They basically mean the same thing. So what exactly is DMST? A seller makes money selling a product to a buyer. The product, as we've already talked about, is a United States citizen, usually under the age of 18. That's a minor. The buyer is typically a middle-aged man. Sometimes the buyer is a woman. Sometimes the buyer is a younger man or an older man. But typically, a middle-aged man is spending money to engage in commercial sex with that product who is a minor. What is actually being purchased for that money is one of three things in the commercial sex industry: actually having sex with that minor, viewing that minor in a pornographic image, whether that's a video or a photograph. That's the commercial sex industry. So a minor being used in pornography, that minor is automatically a victim of human trafficking. And then third, stripping. It is illegal in Texas to strip if you're under the age of 17. So a 14-year-old who's stripping is a victim of human trafficking. The person putting her on that stage and the people viewing that and shelling out money for that, they're all guilty of the crime of human trafficking. So a couple legal facts. The term child prostitute is an oxymoron. It's not possible for a child to be a prostitute because a child cannot consent to sex. So according to TVPA, a child cannot be designated as a prostitute. Most states are catching up to that in their state legislation. Not all of them are there yet, but most prosecutors across the country are not going to prosecute a minor for prostitution these days. We've gotten over that. Additionally, it's very important to understand that the person doing the buying, that middle-aged man who's paying however much money to be in a hotel room with a 14-year-old, that buyer is guilty of the crime of human trafficking, just like the guy who's making her do it, the seller. What that person is actually paying money to do, technically, is to rape a child. And so there's quite a push legislatively and from a paradigm shift in our country that everyone understands that shelling out money to have sex with a minor is shelling out money to rape. And the penalty for that and the stigma for that should be the same as if you went next door and raped your neighbor's 14-year-old. There's no difference. Because you paid money for it doesn't make it any less of a crime than just taking some 14-year-old and engaging in sex with them. So according to Polaris is sort of a clearinghouse of a lot of information about human trafficking in our country. According to Polaris, 74% of DMST victims are part of our child protective services in the United States, or they're somehow in foster care. Not all of them are in foster care, but they have a case open, there's something going on from a CPS standpoint in their world, 74% of the time. Because that's a very vulnerable population, that's easy prey, that's easy pickings for the people who want to pull those kids into the world of domestic minor sex trafficking. They're vulnerable, they're in need, they might not have a place to live, they might be hungry, and we'll talk more about all of those things. But the other flip side of that little triangle there is the math of, that means that 26%, they're not part of the CPS system. They're not that vulnerable child who's in the merry-go-round of foster care. That's That's my grandson, that's my daughter, that's your kids, your nieces and nephews and grandsons and granddaughters. And just because I keep saying that, I just want to make that clear. We don't have really good numbers on how many are boys and how many are girls. The few studies that are out there will give you some numbers that about 20 to 25% are boys and the rest are girls. So 75 to 80% are girls. But it's very difficult to ever have a young man tell you that that has happened to them for a variety of reasons. So we don't really have good numbers on that, but just know that this does happen to boys and happens to girls. So I'm going to show you guys the trailer for a documentary. It's called Chosen. It's by an organization called Shared Hope International. It's the story of two all-American teenage girls who were pulled into the world of domestic minor sex trafficking, and neither one of them was part of the CPS or foster care system, so then they're in that 26%.
We're working with what we have, and I was like, what do we have? And she's like, your body.
I didn't know about sex trafficking until I was in the middle of it.
After a while, you just kind of get used to it. Like, everything that goes around just doesn't seem out of ordinary to you.
We really believed that she was getting ready to be sold. Brianna comes from a small town, was an A student, did everything you hoped your daughter would do.
My dreams were to become a nurse. While I was in high school, I had found a waitressing job.
I love school, I love being around my friends, and my science class was like my big thing.
These traffickers or pimps, they pretend to be an older boyfriend, and these young girls actually fall in love with these guys and believe that this guy loves them back.
He was like 24, he played football at a university. He had bought me some designer jeans and things.
Go to like movies and malls, trips, stuff like that. He bought me a dress and some jewelry because like I didn't really have stuff like that.
It's important for the pimp or the trafficker to separate these girls from their family and their friends.
He really gave me the courage to kind of stand up to my mom.
He was like, you know, just kind of keep it on the down low.
One day he asks for something, and even though she doesn't want to do it, she's so worried about losing him that she will. And once he's had her do it once, he pretty much can control her from then on.
He kept saying that he needed money. So I was like, you know, I'll help you or whatever.
I made a choice that night, but I found out that they actually had chosen me.
So just a little bit more of the story of Brianna, because I find this interesting. So Brianna had a job at a local cafe. She was actually a senior in high school, so she was a little bit older than most of the norm of how this begins. An older couple began coming frequently into that cafe in the small town that she worked, and they befriended her. They came in frequently and they got to know her. At one point in time, one of them, the man or the woman, this older elderly couple, asked, "Do you have a boyfriend?" And she said, no, I don't have a boyfriend. Like, well, if you did have a boyfriend, what would he be like? And she's like, well, I don't know, like, maybe he'd be blonde and he'd have blue eyes, and I kind of think an older guy would be cool, like if he was, you know, and I would want somebody who was smart, like he's going to university, and I like athletic guys, so like if he played football, that would be kind of cool. A couple weeks later, into the cafe walks blonde, blue-eyed guy who tells her he's a football player at a university. So that older couple in the cafe were part of the recruitment process for Brianna. And I'll probably tell you guys a little more of her story at the very end, but I just find that interesting that it's not always how we think it is, right?